Namaste. Welcome to Vichamanthan. My name is Rajashekar Asireddy, and I will be the chair for this evening fireside. Today at Vichamanthan, we are going to explore, can British politics be sleaze-free? We have seen many instances recently where politicians' integrity came under question. And this is not something new. We have been seeing this for a long time, from local governments to the MPs to the Prime Minister. Some or other time, people from across the parties and sections are involved in this. So the question arises, how do we ensure that politicians use their power for the right purposes? Is the existing standard system fit for the purpose? Or is there a cultural problem within the House of Commons? And more importantly, what is the sustainable solution to the present crisis? To explore this topic, we are joined today by Professor Elizabeth David-Barrett, Professor of Governance and Integrity at the University of Sussex. Her research primarily focuses on corruption risks at the interface of business and government, particularly in grand corruption cases. And she's currently writing a book on how state capture manifests around the world. She also works on integrity in public life, focusing on corruption risks arising from conflicts of interest, lobbying, and the revolving door. She also works as a journalist for The Economist, Financial Times, and the BBC World Service. Welcome to Vichamanthan, Elizabeth.
Thank you very much, Rajashekar ji, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Elizabeth, I hope you don't mind me calling you Liz, no one word.
Not at all, please do.
Thank you. We have around 70 minutes in total, and in that there will be 40 minutes of Manthan between Liz and myself, followed by questions from the audience. I encourage all of you to please engage in the discussion, ask your questions on YouTube live chat function. Liz, let's jump straight into the discussion. With your initial remarks in about 4 minutes, if you could address, what do we mean by sleaze in the context of British politics? And also give us some examples. Over to you.
Okay, thanks very much. What do we mean by sleaze? Well, I think that sleaze suggests behaviour that falls short, that it is grubby in some way, but that it's really not meeting the expectations or the standards that we expect of people in public life. It has a certain element of it that suggests a moral failing, so a kind of lapse, I think. And it's a bit different to the term corruption, which suggests rather intent or a deliberate kind of action, which intends to subvert rules. And our definition of corruption is usually the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. So something much more kind of planned, deliberately violating rules and doing so because you're motivated by some kind of private gain. So I think there's an interesting distinction there when we often characterize political scandals in the UK in terms of sleaze, that it almost suggests something that's a little bit accidental, that you've slipped into it, and that's quite different to corruption. And one question I have is, why are we so reluctant to talk about corruption in the UK? We still seem to see that as a term that is useful for elsewhere. So we're happy to talk about corruption in other countries, particularly in lower income countries, but we don't really countenance the idea that there is corruption actually in the UK. And yet we see a number of areas where I think there are real overlaps between politics and business. And those are many risk areas where we can easily slip into political corruption. So this can relate to lobbying. It can relate to the revolving door, where we have people moving in and out of political jobs and public sector jobs versus private sector jobs, which creates a lot of conflicts of interest. And we can see much more systematic patterns often of high-level corruption around the procurement process and patterns that we can call state capture.
And can you give us some examples of recent where we have seen this sort of sleaze in British politics?
Yeah, so we've had a number actually in the last year. So almost a year ago now, there was a big scandal around David Cameron having been involved in lobbying for a company called Greensill. Now, this was controversial and interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, of course, David Cameron is a former prime minister. Now, as a former prime minister, there are certain limits on what he can do in terms of lobbying, but only for 2 years after he leaves office. So, in fact, this lobbying that he was engaging in, was not against the rules in any way. He was perfectly free to do that. But at the same time, the way that he did it, he was taking money from a large company and a lot of money, and he was then using his contacts and his insider connections to try and get beneficial contracts for this company. Now, I think if you ask someone, do you think that's appropriate behaviour for a former prime minister? I think most people would say that really doesn't sound right, particularly given that he was essentially the boss. When he sends a WhatsApp message to the current chancellor saying, "Can you help this company?" That carries a lot of weight. So, in a way, he was abusing that former position and that status, I think, and doing it on behalf of a private company. So that was one big scandal almost a year ago now. There were various things throughout the year, but another one that really sticks in my mind is back in November, the Parliamentary Standards Committee published a report into the conduct of an MP, Owen Paterson, a Conservative MP. And in that report, they found that he had broken the rules about paid advocacy. So MPs are not allowed to act as paid advocates. They're not allowed to take money from a company and then lobby on its behalf.
Sure.
And he was found to have broken those rules quite egregiously and on a number of occasions. And so the Standards Committee, which is the self-regulatory body within the House of Commons, had recommended that he should be suspended for 30 days. Now, the procedure is that if he's suspended for 30 days, the Parliament needs to vote on that and approve it. But even before it got to that vote, the government intervened and started to say that there were all sorts of problems with the process, that it was not a fair or just process. And rather than just allowing the vote on this 30-day suspension, which, after all, it's not that much of a punishment for egregious breaches of the rules, but rather than allowing that, they said, okay, we want to block this, to completely change the system, set up a new kind of committee for looking into whether the standard system should be reformed. Oh, and by the way, that committee is going to be chaired by a Conservative MP, a member of the government, which is against the tradition, which always has the Standards Committee chaired by an opposition member of the House. Now, that was a real affront to the way things that usually work in the UK.
I think you briefly mentioned in your example about some code of conduct and some standard committees. Can you give us a bit more details about what are all this? Is there a code of conduct strictly to follow for the House of Commons and the MPs? And also, what are the systems in place to enforce these values?
Sure. So there is a code of conduct for MPs. We've had one since about 1995. It's actually a code of conduct and then a guide to the rules. So the idea is that the code itself is relatively short, and then the guide goes into much more detail about how you comply with it. That's much more like a 30-40 page document. And the code of conduct starts with the Nolan principles. And these are principles which Lord Nolan came up with and his Committee on Standards in Public Life back in 1995 after another big scandal around MPs taking cash for asking questions in Parliament. And there are 7 Nolan principles, and the idea is that everyone in public life, whether they're in politics or in public service, subscribes to these Nolan principles and that they should guide behaviour. So it's a kind of combination approach. It's these big principles which are quite broad, and then there are much more defined rules which give you, for example, rules about what exactly you have to declare in the MP's register of interest, and whether you can accept gifts and of what value. So the combination is to have the two of those. So you've got this broad principles, much more detailed rules.
And what systems are in place to enforce this code of conduct and this registry and some of other things?
Yeah, so there is an independent commissioner of standards, parliamentary commissioner of standards. She is appointed by Parliament, but she's then quite independent. And also in her office, she has a registrar who looks after those registers of interests. And then there's a standards committee, and the standards committee is composed half of MPs and half of lay members. And this is a relatively new innovation in the UK. They've been there for several years now, but they're people who have often got experience of working in some kind of regulatory role in public service. So perhaps they've got experience of being a regulator for the police or the NHS or the fire service. And so they're bringing in that kind of much more of a public opinion perspective, and yet they've got some expertise as professionals in ethical regulation. So then the balance between the two is that if there is a particular allegation of misconduct relating to an MP, then that can be investigated by the commissioner. So the commissioner will take on collecting all of the evidence, trying to find out what happens. She then submits a report to the committee, but it's up to the committee to decide on whether they agree and whether they think that any sanctions should be imposed as a result of misconduct being found. So it's still a system that gives quite a lot of say to parliamentarians, but it's moved away from self-regulation towards having these more independent bits of regulation in the last 20 years or so. It used to be entirely MPs judging their own conduct, and now we've got these elements of independence through the lay members on the committee and the independent commissioner on standards.
And the independent commissioner can investigate any investigation randomly. She can pick anything that comes into her attention, or does she need to go through either speaker or either from any of parliamentary bodies?
No, she can decide, and she will receive sometimes complaints about people that she can decide to investigate, but she can also decide to investigate things on the basis of other information that's come to light, even in the press. So she does have, and she'll do a kind of triage exercise to try and find out initially what's going on and whether it merits an investigation. There is always the potential that people use these kinds of allegations to try and smear opponents, which we see with a lot of regulatory tools. So it's important that there's a kind of triage at the beginning, but she's got authority to decide on what to investigate.
Right. And from a sustainability perspective, Liz, which we adopt at VM, we believe in effective checks and balances for the power. And how effective are these systems as checks and balances?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, Britain is a pretty old democracy, and like other democracies, it's set up in a way which allows these checks and balances on power. Power is distributed. It's not that any institution should be able to dominate, or really any individual. But having said that, there is also in the UK quite a sort of bias in favour of the executive. So if you're a government that has a strong majority, then actually you can get your legislative programme through this combination of the electoral system and the majoritarian system we have in Parliament. So in fact, there is always a little bit of a risk that the executive can be quite powerful, I think, in the UK system. Right. And so that makes it especially important that those other institutions, the judiciary, the media, and other forms of accountability groups, NGOs, civil society, they've got a really important role to play, I think, in checking the power of the executive, because it is potentially quite powerful in the UK.
Right. And especially while I was researching for this one, another thing came up was the ministerial code. Can you give us a bit more details about, especially in the context of executive, how this ministerial code works and how viable is it when it is enforced, and how effective is it?
Yeah, so in addition to that code for MPs, there's a code for ministers. Yeah. Again, it's a bit odd in the UK because most ministers are also MPs. So they're then supposed to operate under both codes. And that in itself sometimes creates some confusion. Sometimes there are different limits on what you need to declare, for example, in your capacity as a minister and your capacity as an MP. So that creates a bit of ambiguity around which rules apply. But the other thing about the ministerial code is that the policing of it is much more in the gift of the Prime Minister. So there is an independent advisor on ministerial interests, but that person is appointed by the Prime Minister. And when that person reports on an investigation into some alleged misconduct, they report it to the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister decides whether or not to act. And so actually there's a lot of people who have criticised that and said, well, look, this is not really a very independent regulatory mechanism. And in particular, what we've seen in the last couple of years are some cases where the independent advisor on ministerial interests has said that he has found wrongdoing by a minister. And in fact, the Prime Minister has chosen not to act. So that was the case with the allegations against Priti Patel for bullying. The ministerial advisor said that he thought those were founded, and the Prime Minister said, well, I'm not going to do anything about it anyway. And so those kinds of, where the Prime Minister is not taking the advice, although it's within the rules, actually it is a breach of convention and of the norm. So usually the Prime Minister has always taken the advice of the independent advisor. So that not taking advice has in fact led to an independent advisor resigning. Then we've got a new one who's been in post not for very long. He also was quite embarrassed when he was looking into the issue of the Prime Minister's Downing Street apartment being decorated and who had paid for those decorations. And he'd already done an investigation. Then there was another investigation by the Electoral Commission, which uncovered other evidence. And it turned out that he hadn't received that from the Prime Minister. So again, it sort of made that ministerial advisor role look like it's not a particularly strong check on ministerial power. So I think that is an area of the system which is not really performing very well, doesn't really seem like it's fit for purpose. But it's partly about the convention. So, I mean, the idea that the Prime Minister should have the ultimate say over who is in the cabinet, I think makes sense in political terms. But at the same time, you then need people who are going to stick to the convention. If wrongdoing is found, I think it's fair to say, okay, action needs to be taken.
Sure. I think especially in the ministerial code context, we can, as you just explained, we see why that is not very effective. But we are seeing the similar sort of a problem with the MPs as well. Now and then, these sort of problems coming up. What do you see which is not working at all from the Standards Committee or from the Commissioner, Parliamentary Commissioner? What do you see the main challenges in that area? These are not very effective.
Yeah. So one issue is around this lobbying issue, essentially. So, the code quite explicitly says that MPs should not engage in paid advocacy, but it then seems that people have interpreted what paid advocacy is in many different ways, and they often don't think that they're doing paid advocacy, or at least don't say that they're doing paid advocacy. So there's quite a lot of ambiguity there about how you would identify that. And this links as well to many MPs having second jobs. So often they'll be working as consultants for companies, and in which case you have to ask, well, what exactly are they consulting on, and what are the companies buying there? So if they're paying someone for their advice, it seems plausible that the companies at least think that they're paying for advocacy to some extent. So that's a real grey area. And we've also seen with many cases that have come out in the last few months, sometimes MPs seem to be spending a lot of time on those second jobs. Sometimes they seem to be earning a lot of money from those second jobs. So it's created a lot of questions around, is this, I think in the best case scenario, or the most benevolent, is it distracting them from their work? But the more serious worry is that it's actually distorting them in how they do their work and what decisions they're making. And that's what we're really worried about. So actually today, the government published its response to the Committee on Standards in Public Life recommendations around how to change this. And they've said that they don't want, for example, a cap on the amount of money or hours that an MP can spend on a second job. Now, I'm somewhat sympathetic to that, because I think in a way, capping hours or money is slightly missing the point. What we should really be concerned about is that issue of, is it distorting what they do, what they're spending time on, where they're exerting influence? Are they doing it on behalf of some other interest? So I think there could be other ways of regulating that which are not about a cap. And in fact, the Parliamentary Standards Committee has come up with a good suggestion, which I do really like, which is that anyone who takes on that kind of job, they should have to write it into their contract that they're not going to do any paid lobbying for the company, any lobbying for the company. And that contract should be something that the commissioner could ask to see. So I think that's actually quite a good way forward, that would just make it a little bit clearer that it's really not okay for them to lobby, and perhaps flesh out the definition of what lobbying is, so that they can't say, oh, well, I was just doing that in the public interest, not as part of my role as an employee or a consultant to the company.
Right. And especially if we go into the two major things here. Oh, just before we move on to, this is primarily the Standards Committee as well as the ministerial bodies for the MPs and the government. Do we have any sort of systems in place for the local government?
Yeah, so the system for local government has changed quite a lot in the last 15 years probably now. So we used to have something called Standards for England, and we used to have a consistent code of conduct for local government that was the same across the board. And in about 2010, there were a number of reforms made, which actually weakened quite a lot the regulation for local government. One big one, which I think is a real loss, was that the Audit Commission was abolished. And that was a body that did some really great regulatory work. So they would look at what systems were in place in different local governments and compare them. Often it was done through a fairly gentle process of having almost like scorecards. So an element of naming and shaming, but done in quite a gentle way. But they were also able to do independent audits of local government and to appoint external auditors and have inquiries into particular issues. So they were quite a good way of, they performed this interesting function of spotting what risk areas there are in local government and being able to share good practice around local government and to some extent influence and enforce good practice. So that organisation was completely abolished, creating some conflicts, because actually now local governments appoint their own auditors, and of course that creates this issue that we see quite broadly with auditors in terms of, can we trust them to really do independent audits when they're somewhat concerned about getting the contract with that client the next time. So they might be sort of incentivized to try and give a favourable impression. So that's gone. Also, the Standards for England has gone. Local government can now decide on their own codes of conduct. So all of those things taken away. But in addition, the austerity period led to a lot of cuts in local government, as we know, and local government often responded by cutting the kind of backroom functions around compliance, conflict of interest regulation, protecting whistleblowers. And so that leaves the system quite vulnerable, I think, that if there are things going wrong, we're not necessarily spotting them now. We haven't really got good systems in place to spot those problems that might be occurring, and also just to think about across the whole system, how could we improve it in general?
Well, so this looks like there is a lot of big gaps and the vulnerability in the local government. And as of now, we don't even know how much the sleaze or the corruption which is happening in the local government. We're just currently focusing on what's happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And of course, there's much less investigative journalism at the local level. So quite likely there's more happening that we just are not finding out about, because we know that local papers have suffered a lot and don't really have the budget to do investigations anymore.
Wow. Wow. So as the only the media is capturing the big things which are happening in the Westminster, and nothing from the ground, from the local government.
Yeah, unless it's really big. I mean, there are occasionally local government stories that make it to the national level. In Liverpool last year. Yeah. If things go really badly wrong, then the central government can step in, and there are things that can be done. But yeah, how much is just happening fairly quietly, I guess, is the question.
Yeah. I think you briefly mentioned previously, Liz, but what do you see? What sort of changes need to be made into the current system, and especially for the ministerial code, or standards for a parliamentary committee, or for the commissioner in these existing systems? Do you recommend any particular changes?
So I do find this a tricky area, because actually my preference would be that we maintain quite a lot of self-regulation, particularly in Parliament. So I think actually Parliament should be able to regulate itself, and it's a pity in a way that after every scandal we say, oh, we're going to outsource that to more external regulators. Now, I actually think the system works quite well at the moment, so I'm not against having some independent external regulation at all, and I quite like that hybrid. But at the same time, it seems to me there is almost a sort of passing the buck attitude a little bit now, and I think MPs should step up and regulate themselves, and they should be willing to do that. We had some MPs saying, oh, this is just an untenable position for MPs to have to judge their own colleagues. But actually that happens for people who work in compliance and ethics regulators in many other parts of public service. It might be personally awkward, but you need to separate out the profession and your personal relationships. So I would actually prefer it if we kept self-regulation to a large extent in Parliament. But it looks to me like things are going towards constantly introducing more independent elements. So after the expenses scandal, the IPSA was created, an organisation which regulates expenses. So that's entirely external now. After all of the revelations around bullying of staff, we've got a more independent system there too, and there are some moves to try and make the Committee on Standards also a more judicial process. And so while I can see the arguments for that, and it does seem what we're sort of left with that because actually the system is not working that well, what I would prefer is that MPs would step up and say, okay, we're going to start taking our regulatory function more seriously. And that they would do more things like calling out their colleagues when they do things like lying in Parliament, or not living up to these standards. Yeah.
Especially in the parliamentary democracy, where MPs are doing every policy, every law for the whole nation, and they're not able to regulate by themselves, which looks like they are just taking responsibility and accountability for their own actions and their own things which are happening within the Parliament.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that should be part of the role. They should be taking responsibility for that, and it's a sorry state really if they constantly say that they can't do that. Of course, there is the argument that they're marking their own homework, but again, it would be perfectly possible to have respected bodies, who MPs doing that and respected as doing it well.
And also, just it goes to the underlying question, right? Like in the first place, why do these politicians engage in sleaze? Is it in a wider cultural problem within the House of Commons?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question. So I'm not a big believer in general in culture as a cause of corruption and sleaze. I think it's largely about situations that people find themselves in rather than a sort of broader culture. There was some really interesting experimental research done a few years ago by Abigail Barr and Daniela Serra, and they were doing it with experiments. So they had a little game that they got students to play, and in the game you could either be in a public official role, or you could be in a role of a company or investor, or you could be in the role of the public. And essentially, if the public official and the investor did a corrupt deal, they both benefited, and the people who were in the role of the public lost out. And they actually got small rewards, a few pounds for participating in this. And they were all in the same room, so they could immediately see the impact of corruption on the members of the public, as it were. And in that experiment, they did it with students coming into Oxford, so a quite international group. And when they initially did the experiment, they found that the sort of propensity to engage in corruption for those students correlated with their country's score on the Transparency International Corruption Index. So it seemed that, if you came from a country that was highly corrupt, you were going to behave in a corrupt way in this game. So that was already quite interesting, and that would sort of suggest there was this cultural aspect. But they then did the experiment with students who'd been in the UK for a year, and very interestingly, they found that everybody had essentially converged on the UK norm. So that suggests to me that it's much more about your situation and where you are than some big cultural thing. So if you are in a situation where essentially corruption is functional because lots of other things are dysfunctional, then I think you get some corruption as a result of that. At the same time, that's all a fairly benevolent kind of explanation of corruption. And I do think there are some people who are really motivated by status and money, and they're doing it out of much more greed. And there's probably some people in the middle who think that they're doing the right thing, but perhaps also have a slightly arrogant or overconfident perception of themselves and what a good person they are. And so they are apt to justify to themselves bad behaviour because they're so convinced that they are a good person. And I do wonder if there might be a slight British cultural aspect to that around just a sort of hubris, this sort of excessive confidence in what good people, British people are, and how strong democracy is. And I sense a lot of politicians who think that this kind of thing is common sense and easy, and of course we know how to do this, when in fact all of these ethical decisions are complex. And I think
it's part of this good chap theory in the government.
Sorry?
Is it a part of the good chap theory within the
I think
government?
it is a little bit, yes. Yeah. And again, there's research on that people who sort of think they're good chaps are actually quite willing to justify bad behaviour because they're so sure that they're fine and doing well.
And the thing is, just going back to the same question, are the MPs are given enough incentives? Like if there haven't been enough incentives, do you think like they're not going to engage in the sleaze, or do you even get enough incentives?
In the sense of incentives to behave well,
payments, or
yeah. So I mean, it's not a bad salary, the salary of MPs. There has been discussion around if we want to regulate second jobs more or ban second jobs, should we think about a pay increase for MPs? I'm not completely averse to that. I think maybe it could go up a little bit. I wouldn't put it up too high, and I think there's a balance to be struck there. So we don't want to put off people from entering politics because it's a low salary or because they would have to take a big salary cut. So we don't want to exclude people working in certain professions. At the same time, we don't want people who are going into politics because of the salary or the opportunities. So I think it's it's slightly a red herring, I think. The other thing is that in countries where you have increased wages because people have thought that that's a driver of corruption, often you find that it doesn't actually reduce corruption when you reduce the wages. So I think it's a complex relationship between those two things. But I guess the bigger problem is trying to get in a broad section of society into the job of being an MP. And we don't want to do anything that would limit too much who we can get into the role.
Sure. And especially at VM, Liz, we stress quite a bit on Dharma, which can be loosely defined as sustainability. Yeah, in a sustainable political system, we place great emphasis on cultivating good values. How can we do this in British politics?
Yeah, so I think this should start early. I don't think we do nearly enough civic education in this country. I did almost nothing when I was at school, and actually my kids don't seem to do very much nowadays. So there's not much just learning about politics and parliament and local government and how decisions are made and how you can hold them to account. So if we think that in a democracy, a big part of making that work is that we are observing the government and we're willing to act as checks on abuses of power, then you need people who are fairly informed. And I think we should probably all see it as a responsibility to be informed about what's happening in public life. So I would start that pretty young with civic education. And I think then also for politicians and people who do go into public office, I think more nuanced training for them in ethical issues would be really important. So again, not moving too much towards just having rules and policing rules and enforcing rules, but having conversations about, well, actually, sometimes it is quite difficult to know how to weigh up a request from a constituent against what party discipline would require you to do. How do you balance those things in particular situations? And I think equipping people with skills to think about that would be a much more sustainable way of building up the right norms. I also think, though, that they do need to call each other out when they see bad behaviour and not just take the attitude of closing ranks and we're all in it together. So it needs to be a responsibility to regulate each other. It's not about making things unpleasant and trying to catch people out, but just in combination it should work. If we all recognise that it is quite a tough job with some real ethical dilemmas, but at the same time we all do try our best to uphold those standards and call people out when they don't, then that would seem to me like a more sustainable way forward.
Sure. And one of the things you mentioned earlier was some of the MPs were considering whatever they are doing is the right thing, and knowingly or unknowingly. Do we have any systems in place to educate MPs about their responsibilities, their conduct? Are they go through any training process?
Well, they get an induction when they become MPs. So they'll have the registrar will go and talk to them about how they should fill in their register of interests and can advise them on how to do that if they've got specific issues. They'll get training on the code of conduct. But I think, one thing that MPs say is that often that comes quite early on when actually they're quite overwhelmed at the beginning. They've just been through a really hectic election campaign. They get into office, they're trying to set up their office and hire staff and learn how all these silly procedures in Parliament work and what you have to say where to whom, and find your way around. And at that time, you're not really perhaps the most receptive to receiving all of this training and education about the code of conduct. So I think one thing would be to spread that out, so to make that something that you do fairly regularly, but not just a one-off. The difficulty is getting it to be interesting. I mean, we all know we're all in organisations where you now get asked to do a training on this, and quite often you get sent a link to a video and you have to watch it, and they check that you've watched it, and it's not very engaging often. So it is a tricky thing to do right, I think, but we need to find cleverer ways of doing it and get MPs to spend a bit more time on it. I guess the other thing is, whether parties do it. So parties have got different systems around what they do with their candidates. And I think you could probably do more at those earlier stages and more grassroots kind of activity, which would then equip MPs well once they got elected. But it should be something that parties take responsibility for too. And there could be arguments for that. It might be that people are happier to talk about it within a party setting, that they feel it's less confrontational. So that might even work better.
Actually, that's a very good point, because every political party has a certain responsibility, because they are the one ultimately choosing that candidate. So before they give any seat to MP or a candidate, I think there are more responsibilities with them.
Yeah. Absolutely, and it could be a part of the selection process. Yeah.
And before we move on to the next section, Liz, you did quite a lot of work on this corruption and the scandals. And have you seen any other country, or when you compare with our system, UK system, with the rest of the countries across the world, are there any better systems you come across with which works very well?
So I always find that a difficult question, because I do think it's quite sort of context specific. But you tend to have some countries are doing well on some bits and not so well on others. So there are some things that I would pick from the Canadian system. They've got some regulation around lobbying, which makes it quite transparent what's happening in terms of lobbying. So you have to report on meetings and what the content of the meeting was. In the US too, you have to report how much you spent on lobbying. So that's a good source of data. It makes it easier to check what's going on. In Canada, there's also I can't quite remember what it's called. Maybe it's a commissioner or someone who will look into lobbying cases. So a proper regulator specifically on that issue. So that's quite a good thing. Sometimes you've got NGOs that have popped up with really good ideas, so that are perhaps publishing all of the disclosures of assets of politicians online, maybe providing ways to match them up with other data sets around, so for example, if you publish MPs' ownership of companies, you might match that up with companies that are winning contracts from government. So there's quite a lot of exciting work, I think, in civil society around using data that is much more transparent now, and then matching that up to identify where there might be corruption risks. That there's a lot of innovation happening in that area.
We pretty much most of the things we covered from the parliament and either independent systems or within the parliamentary, MPs, regulatory, and the political parties. And in a democracy, I think one of the crucial and the main factor is the individuals as the citizens. From a sustainable system point of view, one of the core ideas we consider is the responsibility, means the individual's ability to respond to the challenges around them in a society. Mm-hmm. Where does citizens' responsibility fits in this?
When the citizens respond, sorry?
Where does citizens' responsibility
right. Yeah.
fit in?
I think it's really important, actually. So I think there's a responsibility to be informed, to participate when you can. So definitely people should be voting, and they should be voting in an informed way. But also to write to your MP about things that bother you. Essentially, MPs do care about that, I think. And when they get big, it's not sackfuls of mail anymore, but bulging email inboxes about particular issues, then that is something that they listen to. They are worried about getting elected next time. Of course, it varies a lot. I think a big problem in the UK is the electoral system. And that does mean that far too many people are in safe seats where actually the MP doesn't have to worry too much about whether their constituents like what they're doing or like what their party's doing, because their seat is safe every time. So actually my number one wish for reform in the UK would be electoral reform, because I think that would really shake things up a lot and make the system more competitive. But there are lots of things that individuals can do. Yeah.
What sort of electoral reforms would you suggest?
I think we need to move towards more proportional representation. It's a real problem. I think that it's so disproportional at the moment, and it makes it very difficult for new parties to enter. It means we are left often with this very majoritarian system where one party is a winner takes all and can do whatever they want without really being very, very much checked in their behaviour. So I would definitely favour some proportional representation.
And especially when it comes to the citizens, to engage them with the more on the political process side of it. Would you suggest like the systems in place? Do we have any systems in place, or should we bring any new systems in place for the more engagement of citizens, like more of a participatory?
Yeah, so I'm really interested in some of this more participatory democracy. There have been a few projects in the last few years around deliberative democracy. So often it works that 100 people are selected as a representative group. They're brought together for a weekend. They have some experts come in to talk to them about a topic. They have plenty of time to discuss and debate with each other. Maybe they come back again the next weekend, and then they come to some decisions together around a big policy area. And I think actually that's, it's really exciting when that happens. It's obviously, it's a big expensive exercise in terms of cost, but people's time as well. So getting people to spend that much time. But what you seem to find is that the people who've taken part in it actually found it really enjoyable. And so I think, we could be doing more of that and having much more citizen engagement in democracy and much better informed decision making.
Sure. It's been almost reaching to 45 to 50 minutes, Liz. This discussion is quite interesting. We could go on like this, but I think we ought to have a few questions from our audience. We'll quickly take a few questions and then we'll move on to it. We got a question, says, what are the prerequisites that we need in practice for self-regulation of standards by MPs to take place?
Great question. So I think we do need information about things like whether MPs are receiving money or have second jobs or own companies. And we need information about how they're voting. Mm-hmm. We then could have much more nuanced and subtle information around what we're trying to get at is, are their decisions influenced or distorted by any kind of outside interests? So, for example, one suggestion has been that if they are working for a company or providing consultancy for a company, that the minutes of meetings with that company should be published, and we should see what they say about that. Another reform that's been recommended is that currently when MPs talk about an issue which might conflict with an interest they have, they do have to declare that at the beginning of their intervention in Parliament, but they do it in this quite old-fashioned way of saying, I refer you to the to my entry in the Register of Interests. Why not just say much more straightforwardly, I receive income from this oil company, and now I'm going to talk about oil. That would be something that would be much easier for people to understand and interpret. It would get the accountability out there. So I think we do need a lot more information and transparency, but I think we also need to think about some of the ways that we then try to use that information and just make it a lot more accessible and open and straightforward.
I think the two things are, one is the MPs to give that accurate information, mm-hmm. and someone can question that one and use that information to challenge them. I think probably this leads to one of the things you mentioned earlier was educating them or informing them what sort of information they should be providing and how clear they should be providing.
Yeah, absolutely. And it becomes an iterative process that then, we gradually learn, what you could do with more information, and can start to expand the remit of what we can access.
Sure. And we got another question. Says, can we properly separate the professional role of MPs from their personal connections, given the strength of the party system and emphasis on party discipline?
Yeah, another great question. So this is very difficult. I mean, if you are an MP, party discipline is really important. Again, we have seen slight differences in how governments treat party discipline. So the current Johnson government has been really strict on requiring loyalty on a lot of decisions and areas where governments would normally have allowed a free vote. So I think, it's partly about how it's used. So we've seen Conservative MPs sacked because they didn't support the government on Brexit, so they've lost the whip. We've seen this very strict in the case of Owen Paterson, and lobbying quite a lot of leaning on MPs to get them to vote alongside that, when that's a standards issue that really shouldn't be a matter of parliament, of party discipline at all. So it's partly about how it's used. But yes, it is a problem. But politicians should be able to to have the freedom to move away from the party on issues, certainly on issues of conscience, but also on issues where they've got a reasoned argument for having a different view to the government. So I think it is a weakness actually of the UK system, that very strong party discipline.
Sure. Just moving on to the next question, Liz. Has civic education been found to be effective in other countries in enabling the public to challenge elected representatives?
Great question. I haven't actually seen research on this. One thing I would say is that in countries that are younger democracies, people often seem much, much more engaged. So I can remember traveling to, certainly I spent a lot of time in Eastern Europe in the late 90s, early 2000s, and people were often absolutely informed and engaged on quite detailed issues of policy. Again, a lot of developing countries that I've been working in, you'll be sitting listening to the radio and people are going on talk radio and they're debating quite complex issues of economic policy. So it seems to me that sometimes when democracy is a bit younger, people are actually treating it as something more precious and they're getting more engaged. And we seem to have lost that to a large extent. And it's partly, I think, that people thought, oh, well, I don't need to engage. It's sort of a luxury of living in a relatively wealthy, mature democracy that they maybe think they don't need to engage. But I think that's probably a mistake. But it is also more recently that the political debate has become quite black and white and quite aggressive. Mm-hmm. And I think that's not really conducive actually to having good, sophisticated discussions.
I think we have another interesting question, probably follow up on to what you just said. Is it realistic to expect citizens to stay informed, given the current polarized media landscape and the role of social media?
Yeah, it is harder to be informed, I think, because you don't really know now what you're reading and whether what you're reading is neutral, if such a thing exists, or you don't know in which ways it's biased. But I think, again, there are some tricks that we can learn for sort of thinking about that. We can think about, looking at the source, trying to understand what the source's funding is, pick a few trusted sources. There are some great fact-checking services around now. I actually think they're brilliant educators. So I love it when their emails pop into my inbox and they say, oh, that thing that a minister said yesterday or that a newspaper reported yesterday, actually we've looked into that and that's not true. Or at least you can't make that inference from the data that's available. So I think actually there are now, we were probably 10 years ago in a phase when that was really difficult to judge what was going on. We're now getting a lot more savvy about the fact that we need to think about potential sources of bias, and we're also getting a lot more help with how to do that. So yeah, it is an ask, but I don't think it's too much to ask, really.
Sure. We've got quite a few questions, Liz, but with the interest of time, we'll take this last one question. Do you find that citizens in the UK are relatively disengaged? And if so, why is that?
Yeah, I do think that citizens in the UK are relatively disengaged, actually. Why is it? So, maybe it is that they've thought that it doesn't matter, and now that could either be that they think that they've got reasonable lives and so they don't need to engage, or it could be that they think that they don't have any influence, so however much they're angry about something, they're not going to be able to affect change. And I do think that latter is quite worrying. And I think there are good reasons for that. That people feel that it's quite difficult to have your voice heard. Particular groups often feel that they're really not heard. So I don't think we're doing a fantastic job of making people feel that democracy is something that serves them, and that the government is there to serve their public interest. So maybe that is partly a matter of building up that civic responsibility, getting people more interested in local government and things that are more obviously not only affecting their lives but more easily influenced, maybe. So I think we need to have a bit of a think about how to make that easier for people and get them involved. And I do think there is a bit of arrogance still. So I sat in recently on some focus groups around what people thought around some of these sleaze scandals, and there is a lot of overconfidence, I think, that the UK is just not a corrupt country and we don't have to worry about things. And some of these country comparisons are not very helpful. Because it might be that in the UK, sure, you don't have to pay a bribe to go and get your passport. But potentially there are a lot of other forms of improper influence that are happening in different ways and maybe at much higher levels, which are influencing actually the outcomes that we're getting. So I think we need to think that our own democracy is not something that is just amazing and also something that is we can take for granted and it's stable. It's something that you need to constantly work at.
That's quite interesting questions and answers, Liz. Before we going to close, in your closing remarks, if you could address, what does a sustainable system look like to enforce the standards to remove sleaze from the British politics?
Yeah, so I think most politicians in Britain go into politics for the right reasons. I think it's not the case that they go into it thinking that they want to make money or that they want to abuse things. They actually want to change things and make people's lives better. And most of them work really hard actually doing that. But it has become quite a difficult environment, I think. And so it's not only very hard work, but we know that MPs get a lot of harassment and criticism on social media, some of it really quite aggressive. And we've had 2 political assassinations in the UK in the last 6 years. We've had 2 MPs killed. I find that quite incredible, really worrying. And so it seems to me we are at a bit of a crisis point where we risk a situation where good people are not willing to go into politics because it seems quite unattractive. It seems something that is going to really invade your privacy and something where you're going to face a lot of pretty vitriolic criticism. So I think actually part of this sustainability is trying to have a bit more forgiving debate actually about what's going on, and not completely jump on people for having different opinions to you, being willing to listen, trying to find the space to engage and find common ground or be okay about disagreeing. So I think there's, in this new world that we're in, where social media is so instant and people are responding, and many of the communication tools that are used are about provoking our emotions and making us feel riled up and angry or defensive. None of that is good for a democracy. And so we need to be better at recognizing when we are being provoked like that, and better at finding bridges to talk to each other across all of those divides. Essentially, we need to not have deep cleavages in society, I think, but be constantly trying to bridge them, and recognize we're all humans with the same kinds of problems and issues and worries and aspirations.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Les. That was very insightful discussion, and I learned quite a few of things, and it's very interesting to see the various dimensions and various facets of this problem. Once again, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. Just to summarize, I think for British politics to be sleaze-free, I think we need politicians who should take responsibilities and accountability for their actions. And also we need systems in place for providing effective checks and balances as well. And also, I think it's equally important to have active citizens who are set up and fully engaged in the political process. I hope you, the audience, found this discussion very useful and insightful. And many of you may be regular to the Vichar Manthan. And for those who joined us today for the first time, Vichar Manthan, or VM for short, is a public engagement platform exploring contemporary British issues through Hindu civilizational lens. Vichar and Manthan both are Sanskrit words, which means where Vichar means ideas and Manthan means to churn. Once again, thank you everyone who joined us today from wherever you are. At the end, VM is a voluntarily led organization where our Karyakartas not only give their time and effort, but many of them are also well-wishers. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all our well-wishers, without whom the work that we do would not be possible. If anyone watching would like to become a supporter by paying one-off or regularly, please use the QR code displayed on the screen, or use the link which is in the comment section. Before you leave today, I would encourage you to subscribe our YouTube channel and also join our mailing list so that we can inform you well in advance about our upcoming events. VM, apart from these events, also runs book clubs. We have a number of book clubs running across the country. Please check our website, which is www.vicharmanthan.org for more information on the book clubs. And also, we have a VM podcast available across all major audio streaming platforms. Please tune in and listen to some of the interesting discussions applying Dharma to different issues. Our next podcast is on freedom and liberty, and which will be available from next Monday onwards. So please tune in. And finally, our next fireside conversation will be on 31st of March at 7 p.m. And the topic is the metaverse, my new real life. I hope to see you all there. Once again, thank you and namaste.